The royal palace stood tall in the heart of the kingdom, a place of wealth and power that only a few ever got the chance to see up close. Its golden walls gleamed in the sunlight, and the sound of horses' hooves echoed as royal processions passed by. For the common folk who lived in the city below, it was a place of mystery and awe. They could only dream of the lavish life behind the gates. One sunny afternoon, a young boy named Ethan found himself in the bustling square near the palace. He wasn't from a rich family, far from it. He lived in a small, modest house with his parents and siblings. Life was hard, and every day was a struggle to make ends meet. But despite the hardships, Ethan was full of curiosity and wonder. Today, like many days before, he had managed to sneak away from his chores to see the palace up close. The chance to witness the royal life felt like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. As Ethan walked through the crowded streets, he couldn't help but feel small among the towering buildings and busy crowds. People rushed past him, their clothes fine, and their voices loud with excitement. They were all focused on something in the distance, the royal procession that would soon pass through. Ethan's heart raced with excitement. He had seen the royal family from afar, but today he was determined to see them up close. The boy weaved through the crowd, trying to find a good spot. He wasn't tall enough to see over the people in front of him, so he tried to stand on his tiptoes, his eyes darting around in search of a glimpse of the grand procession. His excitement grew with each passing second, and before he knew it, he had stepped a little too close to the royal guard, who stood at attention by the entrance to the palace. The guard was a large man, wearing a shiny uniform that glinted in the sunlight. He stood straight, eyes fixed forward, his expression hard and unreadable. Ethan, so lost in his excitement, hadn't noticed how close he had gotten to him. Without warning, as if it were a reflex, the guard raised his hand and slapped the boy across the cheek. The sound of the slap echoed through the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Ethan's face stung from the impact, and he took a step back in shock. His eyes widened, unsure of what had just happened. He hadn't meant to do anything wrong. He was just trying to see the royal family, just like everyone else. But in that brief moment, it didn't matter. The guard, who had been trained to maintain order at all costs, had seen Ethan as a disturbance. The people around them started to murmur. Some looked away, pretending they hadn't seen anything, while others shot disapproving glances at the guard. Ethan stood there, blinking, trying to process the situation. He had never been treated like this before. All he had done was be curious, eager to witness the spectacle everyone was talking about. But to the guard, that curiosity was an offense. The guard didn't even look at him. He just returned to his stoic position, as though nothing had happened. The stain on Ethan's cheek wasn't just from the slap. It was from the injustice of it all. He felt small, invisible, like he didn't matter in a world so far above him. But deep down, there was something more that stirred within him. A sense of confusion, but also a growing sense of anger. Why had he been treated this way? He didn't understand. He was just a boy with a dream, and that was all. As the crowd around them began to settle, Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. But he wasn't ready to walk away just yet. Something had shifted inside him. A quiet determination was beginning to take root. Ethan stood frozen for a few moments, still feeling the sting on his cheek from the guard's slap. His hand instinctively went up to touch the spot, but it wasn't just the physical pain that hurt. It was the confusion, the sense that something was very wrong. Why had the guard slapped him? He didn't understand it. He had only wanted to see the royal family, to catch a glimpse of a world so different from his own. But instead, he had been treated as though he didn't belong. As he stood there, still trying to make sense of what had happened, Ethan noticed the people around him. Some glanced in his direction, their faces filled with pity. Others avoided looking at him, pretending they hadn't seen what had just occurred. But there were a few who looked at the boy with curiosity, some shaking their heads as if to say the guard had gone too far. Ethan caught their gazes, but none of them spoke up. The crowd was large, and most people preferred to stay quiet when things like this happened. It was safer that way, easier to blend into the background and not get involved. The boy's heart sank. He wasn't used to being ignored, but that's exactly what was happening now. It was as though the guard's slap had erased him from existence in the eyes of everyone around him. They all continued to watch the royal procession in the distance, their attention back on the event they had come to see. Ethan, however, could not forget the slap. It wasn't something he could easily shake off. The sting on his face lingered, but the hurt inside was much deeper. The royal guard, meanwhile, seemed to be unmoved by the incident. He stood tall and still, his posture as rigid as ever. It was clear that to him, the slap had been nothing more than a small correction. In his world, he had done his duty, making sure the crowd didn't get too close to the palace. But in Ethan's world, the slap had been a moment of deep injustice. The guard had treated him like he was insignificant, like he was nothing more than a nuisance. Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? He couldn't just walk away and forget about what had happened. His pride, his sense of fairness, wouldn't allow him to do that. He wasn't going to let the guard's actions go unchallenged. But what could he possibly do? He was just a boy from the streets, nobody special. No one would listen to him, or would they? As he stood there, lost in thought, Ethan's gaze wandered across the crowd again. That's when he noticed something strange. Among the people watching the procession, there was a woman who wasn't like the others. She wasn't dressed in the fine clothes the nobles wore, but there was something about her that stood out. She was watching the scene unfold with more attention than anyone else. Her eyes were focused on him, not on the royal procession. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow different, that she had seen what had happened and wasn't content to ignore it. For a moment, their eyes met. The woman didn't look away. She seemed to recognize something in Ethan's gaze, something he didn't even fully understand yet. But there was a silent connection between them, something that made Ethan feel less alone in that moment. He couldn't explain why, but her presence gave him a strange sense of comfort. It was as though, for the first time, he wasn't invisible. Somebody had seen him. The woman didn't say anything, but Ethan felt a flicker of hope ignite inside him. Maybe, just maybe, someone would care about what had happened. Maybe this wasn't the end of his story. Ethan continued to stand there, his mind swirling with thoughts and emotions. The woman who had locked eyes with him had disappeared into the crowd, and now he was left alone with his confusion. The pain on his cheek had faded, but the hurt in his heart only seemed to grow stronger. He couldn't stop thinking about the guard's slap. It wasn't just about the physical pain. It was about the message it sent, the message that he, as a poor boy from the streets, didn't matter. He wasn't important enough to be treated with respect. Ethan had never really felt like he belonged to the world of the rich and powerful. He had always known that his family wasn't wealthy. His parents worked hard every day to provide for him and his siblings, but it was never enough. They lived in a small, run-down house on the edge of the city. There was always something that needed fixing, always something they couldn't afford. But despite all this, Ethan had always held on to the belief that everyone deserved kindness and respect, no matter where they came from. That was the way his parents had raised him, to treat others with decency and fairness. They had always told him that, one day, he could make a difference, no matter his background. But now, standing in front of the royal palace, feeling the weight of the guard's slap still hanging over him, Ethan wasn't so sure. Was that really true? Could someone like him ever make a difference in a world so divided by wealth and power? The rich and powerful seemed so far removed from his life. To them, he was nothing more than a shadow, a face in the crowd. The guard's actions only proved that. As he stood there lost in thought, Ethan's mind wandered back to his family. His parents worked day and night, trying to provide a better life for him and his siblings. They often spoke of how things would get better one day, but Ethan had always known that the chances of that happening were slim. His family was stuck in a cycle, just like so many others in the city. They worked hard, But it never seemed to be enough. His father, a skilled carpenter, had dreams of building a better home for them, one with more space and a sturdy roof. His mother, who worked as a seamstress, always dreamed of sending Ethan to school so he could learn to read and write, something she never had the opportunity to do. They both wanted better for him. They wanted him to have a future beyond the limits of their own lives. But as much as they dreamed of a brighter future, it felt like an impossible dream. How could they ever escape the life they had? Ethan sighed, feeling the weight of those dreams pressing down on him. He looked at the palace once more, its golden walls standing tall and proud in the distance. It felt like a symbol of everything he could never have, a life of luxury, of power, of importance. But then something shifted inside him. Maybe he wasn't meant to stay in this life forever. Maybe, just maybe, he could do something about it. The boy who had been slapped, the boy who had been ignored, could change things. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard the sounds of the crowd around him growing louder. The royal procession was about to pass by. People were moving closer to the road, eager for a glimpse of the royal family. The excitement in the air was palpable, but for Ethan, it was all starting to feel distant. The royal procession, once something he had looked forward to, now felt like a distraction from the truth he had come to realize. He couldn't change the way the world worked overnight, but that didn't mean he had to accept it without question. Maybe there was something he could do, even if it was small. Maybe the first step was standing up for himself. And maybe, just maybe, standing up for himself would be the first step toward changing everything. As Ethan continued to stand there, lost in his thoughts, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. The moment he had locked eyes with the woman in the crowd still lingered in his mind. There had been something about her that made him feel seen, something in the way she looked at him that gave him a sense of purpose. It was as if she understood the weight of what had happened, and perhaps, more importantly, she wasn't willing to just let it pass without notice. Ethan's curiosity began to grow. Who was she? Why had she watched him so intently? She wasn't like the other people in the crowd who had either ignored him or quickly turned their attention back to the royal procession. This woman had stayed focused on him. There was something in her gaze that suggested she knew what it felt like to be overlooked, to be treated as if you didn't matter. The more Ethan thought about her, the more he began to feel that he wasn't alone in his desire for change. Maybe she, too, had experienced the harshness of a world that cared only about status and wealth. Maybe she understood what it felt like to be dismissed, to be judged simply by where you came from. Ethan decided he needed to find out more. Without thinking too much, he began to push through the crowd, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. He didn't know why, but something deep inside him told him that this woman could help him, or at least point him in the right direction. The crowd was thick with people, all excited to see the royal family pass by. But Ethan was focused now. He had a purpose. He scanned the crowd, his eyes searching for the woman he had seen earlier. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spotted her. She was standing near the edge of the crowd, not far from where Ethan had been standing before the incident. Her face was calm, but there was a sense of quiet strength in the way she carried herself. Ethan made his way toward her, his heart beating faster with each step. As he approached, the woman noticed him. She didn't seem surprised, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She didn't say anything at first, but her gaze softened, as if she had been waiting for him to approach. "Are you all right?" she asked gently, her voice kind but filled with an intensity that made Ethan feel like she truly cared. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure how to answer. He still felt shaken from the slap, and he didn't know exactly what he wanted from her. But something in her question made him feel like he wasn't as alone as he had thought. I'm fine," Ethan replied, his voice uncertain. I don't understand. Why did the guard do that? I didn't do anything wrong." The woman studied him for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. She seemed to understand the pain in his voice, the frustration that came from not being treated fairly. "I know," she said softly. "But sometimes In places like this, people like him think they have the right to control others. They believe their position gives them power over those who are different, those they think are beneath them. Ethan's heart clenched at her words. It was exactly what he had been feeling, but hearing it spoken out loud made it all the more real. The woman continued, her tone calm but firm. The thing is, you don't have to accept it. You don't have to believe that you're not important. Ethan looked at her, confused. But I'm just a poor boy. I don't matter to people like him. People like the royal family. They're far above me. The woman smiled softly, a knowing look in her eyes. That's what they want you to believe. But it's not true. Every person, no matter where they come from, has worth. And sometimes it takes someone like you, someone with a different perspective, to make them see that. Ethan's mind was racing. Could it really be true? Could he, someone who had always felt so small in a world so large, actually make a difference? It was hard to believe, but there was something about the woman's words that gave him hope. She took a step closer, her eyes locked on his. Don't let them tell you who you are. You decide that for yourself. For the first time that day, Ethan felt a spark of something inside him. Something stronger than the pain of the slap, stronger than the confusion and doubt. It was a sense of possibility, a feeling that maybe he could change things, not just for himself, but for others too. With a deep breath, Ethan looked at the woman and nodded. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was beginning to believe that the future could be different. That maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as powerless as he had always thought. As Ethan stood there, listening to the woman's words, a new feeling started to bloom inside him. Her encouragement had sparked something that he hadn't felt before. Hope. It was the kind of hope that made him believe he could stand up for himself, even in a world that seemed to want to push him down. He had always been taught to stay humble, to accept his place in the world. But the woman was right. Maybe it didn't have to be that way. Maybe he could change things, but where would he even begin? The royal procession was still moving in the distance, and the crowd around them grew louder with excitement. But for Ethan, the grandeur of the event no longer held the same appeal. He had been so caught up in wanting to see the royal family, but now he realized that the world he had been dreaming of wasn't the world that mattered most. He had just witnessed the inequality that existed, the way people like him were treated like they were invisible. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. But how could he change it? The woman seemed to sense the uncertainty in his thoughts. She smiled at him gently, as if she understood the weight of the decision that was forming in his mind. You don't have to have all the answers right now, she said, her voice steady. The first step is to believe in yourself. Once you do that, the rest will follow. Ethan looked at her, still unsure of what to say. He was just a boy from a poor family. How could he possibly make a difference? What could he do to challenge the way things were? But the woman's words echoed in his mind, urging him to see beyond what he had always known. Maybe it didn't have to be a grand act. Maybe it could start with something small. Thank you, Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. But I still don't know what to do. The woman gave him a reassuring smile. You'll figure it out. Just remember, change doesn't always happen overnight. It takes time, and it starts with one step. The important thing is not to let fear stop you from trying. Ethan nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. He had always felt like he was stuck in a cycle, like there was no way out. But now, standing here with this woman, he realized that the first step toward breaking free from that cycle was simply believing he could. Before he could say anything more, the woman turned to leave. Ethan watched her disappear into the crowd, her presence leaving behind a feeling of hope that he couldn't quite explain. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the same boy he had been just a few minutes ago. Something inside him had changed. As the royal procession continued, Ethan looked around at the people who were still eagerly waiting to catch a glimpse of the royal family. The excitement in the air was contagious, but for Ethan, it no longer seemed as important. He had seen the power that the rich and powerful held over others, But now he also understood that there was a way to fight back. The world wasn't as fixed as it seemed. Change was possible, even for someone like him. Ethan felt a new sense of determination. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he knew he couldn't just stand by and let things stay the same. He couldn't let people like the Royal Guard keep treating others as if they didn't matter. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to stand up and prove that he was more than just a poor boy from the streets. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, Ethan made a promise to himself. He would find a way to make a difference. It wouldn't be easy, and it might take time, but he would start. He would make sure that he and others like him were no longer overlooked, no longer invisible. He took a deep breath, ready for whatever would come next. It was time to take the first step toward change. In the days that followed, Ethan couldn't shake the conversation he had with the woman in the crowd. Her words echoed in his mind, urging him to believe in himself and take action. At first, he wasn't sure how he could start. He had no power, no wealth, and certainly no influence. How could a boy like him ever make a difference in a world dominated by the rich and powerful? But with each passing day, the thought of standing up for what was right grew stronger inside him. Ethan returned to his daily routine, working hard at home to help his parents, doing his chores, and helping care for his younger siblings. Yet, as he went about his day, his mind was constantly thinking about the conversation with the woman. He could no longer just accept the world as it was. The Royal Guard's slap had been a wake-up call. It had shown him how easily people in power could dismiss someone like him, simply because he didn't have the status or wealth they valued. He spent many nights lying awake, wondering what he could do. He had no grand plan, no idea of where to start, but he knew one thing. He couldn't just be quiet anymore. The world had to change. Maybe he wasn't the one who could change everything at once, but he could be the one to start. One afternoon, as Ethan was walking through the town square on his way to run an errand, he saw a group of children gathered around a large barrel. The children were laughing and playing, their faces full of joy despite their circumstances. They were from families who, like Ethan's, didn't have much. Yet they seemed happy in that moment, their worries forgotten as they played together. Ethan smiled at the sight. It reminded him of his own childhood, the simpler days before he started noticing the differences between the rich and the poor. Curious, he walked over to see what they were doing. As he got closer, he saw that they were trying to push a cart filled with firewood. It was heavy, and they weren't making much progress. One of the older boys, about Ethan's age, was trying to lift it on his own, but the cart was simply too much for him. Ethan watched them struggle for a moment. Then he stepped forward. "Hey, need some help?" he asked. The boy who had been struggling with the cart looked up, his face a mixture of surprise and relief. "You'd help us?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Of course. It's easier if we all work together." Without another word, Ethan joined the group. Together, they managed to move the cart much faster. As they worked, the other children chatted with Ethan, telling him about their families, their dreams, and the struggles they faced. Ethan listened carefully, realizing that they all had the same worries, trying to make ends meet, struggling with the unfairness of the world, and dreaming of something better. When the cart was finally moved to its destination, the children clapped and cheered. They seemed to be proud of what they had accomplished together, even if it was a small task. But to Ethan, it was more than just moving a cart. It was a reminder of how powerful it could be when people came together, even if they had little to offer. Ethan looked around at the children, a sense of warmth growing in his chest. He realized that change didn't always need to come from grand actions or big gestures. Sometimes it started with small acts of kindness, with people helping each other and standing up for what was right, even if it was just in their own community. Maybe that was where it all began, one small act at a time. "Thanks for your help," the older boy said, giving Ethan a grateful smile. "You've got a good heart." Ethan smiled back. "It's the least I can do. We've got to look out for each other, right?" As the children dispersed and went their separate ways, Ethan felt a new sense of purpose. This was just the beginning. There was still much to do, but he was no longer afraid to take that first step. Whether it was helping a group of children move a cart or standing up for what was right, he now understood that change could start with small actions, and small actions could lead to something much bigger. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt hopeful. He might not know exactly what his future held, but he knew he was on the right path. And with each new day, he would take another step toward the change he wanted to see in the world. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's resolve to make a difference only grew stronger. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing inside him. The more he helped others, the more he began to see the impact of even the smallest actions. It was as if the world, in all its complexity, had started to reveal itself to him in a new light. He had once seen it as a place of harsh divisions, where the rich and powerful held all the cards and people like him were left to fend for themselves. But now he realized there was more to it than that. There was power in kindness, in standing up for what was right, and in doing something good, even when the world seemed indifferent. Ethan had started to get involved in his community more than ever before. Every time he saw someone in need, he didn't hesitate to offer his help. It wasn't always easy, and sometimes it meant going out of his way. But each time he helped someone, he felt a little more confident. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing up for people when they needed it the most. Sometimes it was something as simple as carrying groceries for an elderly woman, helping a neighbor with repairs, or just lending a listening ear to someone who was feeling down. As he spent more time with the people in his community, Ethan noticed something important. There was a shared understanding among them, an unspoken bond that connected everyone. They might not have had much in terms of money or status, but they had something far more valuable: each other. The more Ethan saw this, the more he understood that the power to change things didn't come from having wealth or influence. It came from the people, from the everyday acts of kindness and support that held them all together. But as much as Ethan felt a sense of pride in his efforts, there were still moments when doubt crept in. Sometimes he would wonder if his small acts could ever add up to something larger, something that could truly challenge the deep-rooted inequalities in the world. After all, how could a boy from a poor family ever compete with the royal guards, the powerful families, or the system that kept people like him in their place? One evening, as Ethan was walking home from helping a neighbor, he found himself standing outside a grand, imposing building that he had walked past countless times before, the palace. It was even more magnificent at night, the lights reflecting off the marble and gold, casting a glow that made the entire place look untouchable, like a world apart from his own. He stood there for a long time, staring at the palace, wondering if he would ever have a chance to make a real difference in a world so distant from his own. Could someone like him ever be heard by those inside those walls? Could someone like him ever stand before the powerful and demand change? Or was he destined to remain invisible, just another forgotten soul in a world that didn't care? As he stood lost in thought, a familiar voice interrupted his daydreaming. It was the woman, the one who had spoken to him during the royal procession. She was standing a few feet away, watching him with a kind, knowing expression on her face. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" she asked softly. Ethan didn't know what to say. "I don't know," he muttered. "Sometimes I wonder if anything I'm doing really matters. The world still feels so big, and people like me are still treated like we don't count." The woman took a step closer, her gaze steady and calm. "You matter more than you think. It's not about changing everything at once. It's about taking the first step, and then the next. You've already made a difference in the lives of the people around you. And those small differences, they add up." Ethan looked at her, unsure of how to respond. It felt like she was speaking the truth, but part of him was still unsure. "But how can I do more? How can I make the powerful see that we're all just people? How can I make them care?" The woman smiled gently. "The powerful may not always listen, but that doesn't mean you should stop. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is show up, speak your truth, and help others find their voice too. There's power in unity, Ethan. When enough people come together, even the strongest walls can be torn down. Ethan's life began to change in ways he hadn't expected. The more he worked with his community, the more he realized how powerful a group of determined people could be. Word of his small acts of kindness spread throughout the town, and before long, more and more people were reaching out to him. They wanted to join in, to be part of something that was bigger than themselves, something that wasn't just about survival, but about standing up for what was right. At first, it started with small gatherings. Ethan would meet with a few people in the town square after work, and together they would talk about the issues they faced. How the rich seemed to control everything, how the poor were left to fend for themselves, and how it seemed like no one in power ever cared about their struggles. They would share their stories, listen to each other, and most importantly, they would begin to plan ways to help one another. Sometimes it was as simple as helping a neighbor fix their roof or organizing a food drive for families who were struggling. But even these small acts began to feel significant, as if they were laying the foundation for something much larger. Ethan found himself becoming a natural leader in the group. People respected him not because of his wealth or status, but because of his sincerity and willingness to help. He didn't talk about change just to hear himself speak. He backed up his words with action. And that was something that set him apart. He didn't seek attention or praise for the things he did. For Ethan, it was never about being recognized. It was about making sure people didn't feel invisible anymore. But it wasn't always easy. As the group grew, so did the challenges. There were times when they encountered resistance. Some of the more influential people in the town didn't like the way things were changing. They were used to having things go their way, and the idea of ordinary people standing up for themselves was unsettling to them. There were whispers, there were subtle threats, and there were moments when Ethan felt like everything might come crashing down. But even during those difficult times, Ethan never wavered. He knew the road to change wasn't easy. One evening, as Ethan walked home from one of their meetings, he thought about how far he had come. Not just him, but all the people who had joined him along the way. They had all found strength in each other, and that strength had made them powerful. They were no longer waiting for someone else to make things right. They were doing it themselves, in their own way. As he approached his home, he saw a familiar face standing by the doorway. His younger sister, Clara. She was holding something in her hands, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When she saw him, she ran over to him with a smile. "Ethan, look," she said excitedly. "I made this for you." Ethan knelt down to take the bundle from her hands, and as he unwrapped it, he realized that it was a small, hand-sewn patch for his jacket. It was simple, but there was a heart stitched into the fabric. Clara had made it herself, a symbol of love and support. "You've been working so hard," Clara said, her voice filled with pride. "I wanted to give you something to remind you that we're all behind you." Ethan's heart swelled as he looked at the patch. It wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a reminder that change was not just about big actions or grand gestures. It was about the people who stood with you, who supported you through thick and thin. And for Ethan, that was more important than anything else. With a smile, he hugged his sister tightly. "Thank you, Clara. This means more than you know." As Ethan looked around at the life he had built, he realized that his journey wasn't over yet. There was still so much work to be done. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had found his purpose, and it wasn't just about changing the world. It was about changing the lives of the people around him, one step at a time. Ethan knew that the fight for fairness, equality, and kindness would be long and difficult. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his community, his family, and the people who believed in what they were doing. Together, they would continue to push forward, no matter the obstacles. As he walked into his home that night, the patch in his hand felt like a symbol of everything they had accomplished and everything they still had to achieve. And for the first time, Ethan knew that change was not just a dream. It was a reality in the making.